The sky over Europe was a graveyard. Burning streaks of aluminum fell through the clouds like dying stars. The war in the air had become a slow massacre, a contest not of men, but of endurance. And for a long time, the Luftwaffe ruled that sky. But one morning above the gray fields of France, a new shape appeared. Small, slender, almost delicate. German pilots who saw it for the first time through their gun sights laughed. Ein Spielzeug, they said. A toy. A fragile foreign toy that didn't belong in real combat. They didn't know yet. That toy would become their executioner. In 1940, when Britain burned under the Blitz and American factories still slept in peacetime rhythm, no one imagined that salvation could come from such an unremarkable machine. The North American P-51 Mustang was never meant to be legendary. It was born out of desperation, a last-minute order from the British to an American company that had never built a fighter before. The first prototypes rolled out in 1941, smooth, fast, but unconvincing. It could turn, but not climb. It could dive, but not breathe above the clouds. The engine, an Allison V-1710, gasped for air at high altitude where the real war was fought. In Berlin, Luftwaffe officers pinned photographs of the Mustang to their walls and smirked. Too light, too soft, too late. They were right, for now. The war in the air was not about glory. It was about mathematics, fuel, distance, and blood. By 1943, the American 8th Air Force had begun its daylight bombing campaign over occupied Europe. Hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators crossed the North Sea each day, carrying tons of bombs toward German factories. But their escorts, the short-ranged P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, could only fly part way. Beyond the point of no return, the bombers were alone. That's when the Luftwaffe came. Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, shadows diving from the sun. They tore through the bomber formations like wolves in a herd of cattle. In one mission over Schweinfurt, 60 bombers didn't come home. 600 men vanished into smoke and cloud. The Americans called it Black Thursday. The skies above Germany had become a slaughterhouse. Young American crews, barely 20, climbed into their aircraft each morning knowing the odds. They scribbled letters to mothers, to sweethearts, to wives they might never see again. Then they took off, flying toward the heart of Europe. And somewhere in a hangar in Britain, engineers stared at the P-51, that rejected toy, and wondered, what if we could give it a heart that could breathe where the Luftwaffe ruled? The answer came from across the channel, from an engine with a name that already carried myth, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that had kept the Spitfire aloft when Britain stood alone. When the Merlin met the Mustang, something changed. It wasn't just faster. It soared. At 30,000 feet, where bombers bled and Luftwaffe aces waited, the new Mustang didn't fall behind. It hunted. In early 1944, the German radar screens lit up as usual. Another formation of American bombers, stretching for miles across the sky. The Luftwaffe scrambled. Messerschmitts climbed into the cold light of dawn. But that day, the hunters found something waiting for them. Sleek silver shapes diving out of the sun. Fast, silent, relentless. Their contrails crossed like sword lines in the sky. One German pilot would later write in his diary, "They came from nowhere, faster than anything we had ever seen. By the time I saw them, they were already behind me." From that day on, the balance of the air war tilted, quietly at first, then completely. The Luftwaffe, once feared as invincible, began to crumble. Airfields burned. Fuel lines dried up. Veteran pilots were replaced by boys with weeks of training. And over every battlefield from Normandy to Berlin, the sound of the Merlin engine echoed, sharp, metallic, and merciless. The toy plane had grown teeth, and the empire that laughed at it was about to choke on its own arrogance. Europe, 1943. The continent groaned under the weight of war. Cities lay in ruins, rivers ran black with oil, and the sky, once filled with birds, belonged now to the machines of men. Above it all, the Reich's iron wings spread wide. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Hitler's Blitzkrieg, still held the upper hand in the air. Its pilots were seasoned killers, men forged in the battles over France, Poland, and Britain. They had names whispered with respect and fear: Galland, Barkhorn, Hartmann. Each carried dozens, even hundreds of kills. Each had survived where others had vanished in flame, but beneath the confidence, cracks had begun to show. The fuel was running thin, factories were bombed. And the new generation of German pilots no longer had years of training. They had weeks. The sky was still theirs, but the cost of holding it was bleeding the Reich dry. Across the Channel, another storm was building. In the airfields of southern England, thousands of men worked day and night. Mechanics, engineers, gunners, pilots, and the women of the WAF who directed the flow of war from behind radio sets. The hum of engines never stopped. The scent of oil and sweat hung in the air like a second skin. Every morning, bombers rose from those green fields, climbing toward the continent. Their mission was simple: cut the arteries of the German war machine, destroy its factories, its fuel, its nerve. But the cost was unbearable. Between August and October 1943 alone, nearly 26% of all bomber crews were lost. That meant 1 out of every 4 aircraft never returned. They called it the air war over Europe. But for the men who lived it, it wasn't a war. It was an execution. Inside the briefing rooms, chalk dust drifted over maps of Europe. The red circles of German air defenses spread across France, the Netherlands, and into Germany's heart. The bombers could reach those targets, but their escorts could not. The P-47 Thunderbolt, tough as a tank, could only accompany them halfway. The P-38 Lightning went a bit farther, but not far enough. The last stretch, the most dangerous stretch, was flown alone. When the Mustangs first arrived in Britain, they were outsiders. Pilots looked at the sleek fuselage and narrow wings and shrugged. Too new, too fragile. American-built, but British borrowed. No one trusted it yet. It was Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, a polo player, not an engineer, who saw the potential. He had flown in World War I, understood speed and maneuver. He believed that if this plane were given a Merlin engine, it could outfly anything in the German arsenal. Many laughed at him, but the few who didn't would soon change the course of the air war. Meanwhile, over Germany, the Luftwaffe was stretched to the breaking point. Its pilots woke to the sound of sirens almost daily. Industrial centers, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Bremen, Hamburg, were bombed again and again. Firestorms swallowed entire cities. Civilians dug in the rubble while anti-aircraft crews loaded shells without sleep. The Reich's propaganda machine told the people they were winning. But every night, the horizon burned red. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most respected aces, once said, "We were fighting the most powerful air force the world had ever seen, and we were running out of sky." By late 1943, both sides were exhausted. The Americans had the numbers, the machines, the industry, but not the reach. The Germans had the experience, the aces, the defensive advantage, but not the fuel or time. And between them, the air war reached a deadly stalemate. The bombers could not be stopped, but they could not survive either. That's when the P-51 Mustang began its silent evolution. The British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine turned it from a second-rate fighter into a predator. Suddenly, the Mustang could climb above 30,000 feet, dive faster than any German fighter, and, most importantly, fly deep into Germany and back. It could go all the way to Berlin. When the first Merlin-powered Mustangs flew in late 1943, their range changed everything. No longer would bombers fly alone into the storm. Now, they had guardians. For the young pilots of the 354th Fighter Group, the first to fly the P-51, it was a revelation. They were told to go hunting. to fly ahead of the bomber stream and draw the Luftwaffe out, to take the fight to the enemy instead of waiting for it. Their first kills came fast. Mustangs dived through German formations like lightning, their 650 caliber guns spitting flame. They could roll, climb, and turn faster than the Messerschmitt, Bf 109, or Focke-Wulf 190. The Luftwaffe, for the first time, was forced onto the defensive. German pilots radioed warnings across squadrons. Achtung! Neue amerikanische Jäger! Caution! New American fighter! But it was already too late. The war in the air was about to shift irreversibly, and within months, the very sky that once belonged to the Reich would become its grave. Yet behind every machine, every contrail drawn across the frozen heavens, there were men, tired, young, afraid, who carried out that transformation. Some would live to tell the story. Most would not. The next chapter belongs to one of them, a man who flew the toy plane into the heart of hell and never came back. The morning was pale and brittle. Frost clung to the grass at the edge of an English airfield. The smell of fuel, cold metal, and wet canvas mixed with the mist. Somewhere, a generator coughed to life, followed by the low hum of aircraft warming up for flight. In the distance, a man stood beside a silver P-51 Mustang, tracing his gloved hand along its fuselage. The name painted beneath the cockpit read, Marie. His name was Captain John Red Tobin, though most of his comrades just called him Red. He wasn't a general or a famous ace. He was one of the many American volunteers who had flown for the RAF before America officially entered the war. A barnstormer before the war, a restless soul during it. He had seen too much sky to ever return to quiet life again. The plane beside him was brand new, one of the first P-51Bs fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Sleek, untested, dangerous. The men joked that the Mustang looked like it was built by artists, not engineers. But to Tobin, it was something more. He had flown Spitfires, P-40s, even the heavy Thunderbolt. None of them had felt quite like this. When he first opened the throttle of the Mustang, it didn't growl, it sang. She climbs like a devil and dives like a prayer, Tobin had written in a letter home to his sister. If we can get this bird into Germany, maybe we can bring the boys back alive. That winter of 1943, the 354th Fighter Group prepared for a mission that few believed possible. Escort American bombers all the way to Bremen, deep into German territory, and back again. It would be the first true long-range escort mission in history. The men of the 354th were young, most under 25, and few had ever seen combat. But they were tired of hearing about the bombers that never returned. They had seen the empty bunks, the letters that went unanswered. Now, for the first time, they had the wings to change it. Before dawn, the pilots gathered in the briefing hut. Cigarette smoke drifted above the flickering projector as a major pointed to the map. Target: Bremen. Heavy industrial area. Flak expected here, here, and here. He tapped the red circles with a stick. German fighters likely to intercept near Oldenburg. Remember your fuel discipline. We're not sightseeing. A few nervous laughs. No one said much. Outside, the air was sharp and colorless. Mechanics tightened bolts, checked guns, and patted the fuselages like horses before a race. The P-51 sat in two neat rows, their canopies fogged from the cold. Tobin climbed into Marie and adjusted his oxygen mask. He tapped the photograph taped to the dashboard, a girl in a white dress smiling under a tree back in Kansas. The note beneath it read, "Come home soon." He smiled faintly. He wouldn't tell her that in war. Soon often meant never. Engines roared to life across the field, a rising symphony of power. The Mustangs taxied out, their silver wings flashing in the low sun. The propellers cut through the mist like blades through silk. Then, one by one, they lifted from the runway. From the ground, it looked like a flock of birds ascending into a storm. At 20,000 feet, the air was thin and blue. Below them, the bombers formed their great metallic river, crawling toward the continent. For hours, there was nothing but engine noise, radio chatter, and the endless sky. And then, static crackled. Bandits, 11 o'clock high. German fighters, Messerschmitts, dozens of them, were rising fast from the direction of Bremen. The Luftwaffe had come to finish what they always did, tear the bombers apart. But this time, the sky didn't belong to them. Tobin rolled the Mustang over and dove. The Merlin engine screamed. The air around him blurred. Below, he saw the black dots of enemy fighters twisting through the bomber formation, guns flashing. He lined up behind one. The Mustang's nose quivered slightly. A heartbeat, and then fire. Tracers arced forward, cutting through the gray. The Messerschmitt exploded into a burst of orange flame. He didn't have time to celebrate. Another enemy was already behind him. "Brake right! Brake right!" The radio crackled. He yanked the stick, pulling the Mustang into a steep climb. The G-force pressed him into the seat. The German overshot, unable to follow. The Mustang's speed carried it upward like a bullet through the clouds. "God, she's fast," Tobin muttered under his breath. In the chaos below, bombers held their course. The Mustangs weaved through them like angry hornets, breaking up the German attack. For the first time, the bomber crews looked up and saw friendly fighters still there, still guarding them, even over Germany. When the mission ended and the surviving aircraft limped home over the North Sea, the radio filled with static and exhausted laughter. They had lost men, yes, they always did, but far fewer than before. The Luftwaffe had met something new that day. At the airfield, Tobin landed Marie on trembling legs. The mechanics ran out, waving, shouting. He didn't speak. He just sat there for a moment, engine ticking softly, staring at the horizon. He had seen death. He had felt victory. But both felt strangely the same. That night, he wrote another letter. "We made it back from Bremen. The new plane's a miracle. But the sky never forgets. Every time we win, it still feels like losing." He folded the letter carefully, sealed it, and placed it in the mailbag. It would never reach Kansas. By spring of 1944, the sky over Europe had changed color. It was no longer the iron-gray domain of the Luftwaffe. It had become something else, alive, dangerous, unpredictable. The air itself seemed to tremble with the sound of the Merlin engine. Everywhere the bombers went, the P-51s followed. The Luftwaffe, once the hunter, was now being hunted. At dawn, in the frozen hangars outside Berlin, ground crews worked under flickering lamps. The war had drained Germany's veins. Oil was scarce, pilots scarcer. But still, the fighters rose. Major Günther Röhl, one of Germany's most skilled aces, stared at his reflection in the canopy of his Bf-109. He had over 200 victories, most against the Soviets. "But now," he said later, "we were fighting ghosts. They came from nowhere, faster than anything we had seen. The ghosts were Mustangs." That same morning, hundreds of miles west, over the low clouds of Belgium, a river of silver wings shimmered in the pale light. The 8th Air Force's bombers were heading toward Germany again, and this time they were not alone. The tactical transformation was complete. Before, Allied fighters had to stay close to the bomber formations, protecting them like shepherds guarding sheep. The Luftwaffe learned to exploit that, attacking from above, drawing the escorts away, and then slicing into the bombers from the rear. But now, the Mustangs could range far ahead. Their endurance, over 1,000 miles with drop tanks, gave them a new mission. Not just escort, but annihilation. The new orders from General James Doolittle were short and brutal. Go out and kill the Luftwaffe. The Mustang group swept over German airfields before the bombers even arrived. They strafed runways, destroyed parked aircraft, ambushed takeoffs. Suddenly, the hunters were being killed before they could even take off. The Germans tried to adapt. They pulled their fighter units closer to key industrial zones, protecting ball-bearing plants, synthetic fuel factories, and the last remaining oil fields in Romania. They created emergency airfields and forests, hidden under camouflage nets, but it was like trying to stop a storm with bare hands. Fuel shortages crippled training. Replacement pilots were barely out of school, some with as little as 40 flight hours. They were sent into combat against men who had been fighting for years. In their diaries, Luftwaffe instructors described the new recruits. They can take off, they can land, but they cannot survive. By early 1944, veteran aces began to die, not because they lost their skill, but because they were outnumbered, outclimbed, outflown. The Mustang's advantage wasn't just speed or range, it was balance. The Merlin engine gave it power at high altitude. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag, allowing it to glide like a knife through the air. And its fuel tanks, one behind the pilot, two under the wings, extended its reach deep into enemy territory. But there was something else, a psychological edge. To the bomber crews, the sight of those sleek silver planes weaving above them was hope itself. To the Luftwaffe, it was dread. One German pilot later wrote, "When we saw them, we knew the mission was already lost." March 1944, the air campaign over Germany reached its crescendo. Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, was launched. The goal: cripple the Luftwaffe once and for all. For 7 days, waves of bombers struck aircraft factories at Leipzig, Augsburg, and Regensburg. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had left into the sky. Hundreds of Bf-109s and FW-190s. It was the largest air battle of the European War. Captain John Red Tobin and the 354th were among the escorts. As they crossed into Germany, Tobin's squadron climbed above the bomber stream. Contrails twisted like white scars across the blue. Then came the call. "Bandits! 11 o'clock!" The sky erupted. German fighters dove head-on through the bomber formation, guns blazing. B-17s exploded in midair, fireballs tumbling into the clouds. The air was filled with debris, smoke, and the staccato scream of engines tearing themselves apart. Tobin saw a Messerschmitt line up on a crippled bomber. He pushed the throttle forward. Marie responded instantly, surging ahead like an arrow. He fired. The German fighter burst into flame and spiraled down, but in the same moment, tracers sliced past his canopy. Another German was on his tail. Tobin rolled hard, diving through the bomber formation. The G-force blurred his vision. He leveled out, pulled back, and fired again. Too late. A single round hit his right wing. Smoke. Warning lights. The engine coughed. His squadron leader's voice crackled over the radio. "Red, you're hit. Bail out." But Tobin didn't answer. He was still over Germany, too far from the lines. Below him, the bombers still flew. Heavy, slow, exposed. He steadied Marie, leveled his wings, and turned back toward the formation. "If I'm going down," he whispered, "I'm not going alone." Witnesses from the 354th saw his Mustang dive into a cluster of attacking Focke-Wulfs. Gunfire, smoke, then nothing. Marie disappeared into the clouds. When the mission ended, the Americans counted the losses. They had lost bombers. They had lost men. But the Luftwaffe had lost something it could never recover. Its backbone. Hundreds of German fighters were destroyed that week. More importantly, they lost pilots. By April, Luftwaffe command admitted what no one dared say aloud. The air defense of the Reich was collapsing. Galland himself told Goering, Herr Reichsmarschall, the Americans now own the daylight. At the airfield in England, the 354th returned one plane short. Tobin's bunk was empty. His mail sat unopened. The ground crew cleaned the oil stains from the tarmac and waited for the next dawn. The war didn't pause for grief. Still, someone painted a small name on the nose of a new Mustang that arrived weeks later. It read, Marie the Secu. The sky had changed forever. From that spring onward, the Luftwaffe's great eagles, once the terror of Europe, became scattered feathers in the wind. Every time the bombers flew, the Mustangs followed. And the German pilots who once mocked the toy plane learned to fear its shadow. The roar of the Merlin engine became the sound of their empire dying, not with a crash, but with the slow, metallic rhythm of inevitability. The morning after the mission, the sky over England was quiet. No engines, no shouting, only wind moving through the hangars, carrying with it the faint smell of fuel and burned oil. In the dispersal hut, a single mug of coffee cooled beside an empty chair. The name stenciled on the back of the flight jacket still hung by the door, Captain J. Tobin. Someone had placed his leather gloves on the table, folded neatly. No one spoke. War doesn't announce its losses. It leaves small, silent gaps. An untouched bunk. A letter that never comes. A name scratched off the roster. The men of the 354th had grown used to those gaps, but never comfortable with them. Each time a pilot didn't return, the laughter in the mess hall got quieter. Cigarettes burned, shorter. The radio music seemed out of place, yet the missions continued. They flew every day the weather allowed, sometimes twice, and every time they climbed through the low English fog into the pale blue light above, the absence was there, riding behind them, like another shadow in formation. For Lieutenant Carl Mickey Anders, Tobin's wingman, the silence was the hardest part. He had seen Marie disappear into the cloud bank, fire trailing from her right wing. He waited for the parachute that never came. When he landed back at Boxhead, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He sat by the runway long after the engine stopped, helmet still on, staring at the horizon. That night, he couldn't sleep. The sound of the Merlin engine still echoed in his ears, not as a roar, but as a low, steady hum, like a heartbeat fading away. The next morning, Anders found the letter Tobin had written before the mission. It was still sealed, addressed to his sister in Kansas. The base clerk placed it quietly on his bunk. He turned it over in his hands, reading the name, the handwriting. He didn't open it. Instead, he tucked it inside his flight jacket and flew with it every mission after that. "You don't lose people up there," he later said. "You carry them." In the weeks that followed, the Mustangs pressed deeper into Germany. The victories grew, and so did the losses. Some pilots became aces overnight. Others never lived to see a second sortie. But each man knew. Every bomber that reached its target. Every factory that fell silent under Allied bombs. It came at a cost they could measure in names, not numbers. On some mornings, the airfield smelled of spring. Wet grass, sunlight breaking through clouds. On others, it smelled of smoke, of burned oil and cordite, of the kind of silence that only follows death. Anders remembered one particular dawn. The ground crew had painted a small inscription beneath the canopy of his new Mustang. It read, "For Red." He didn't ask them to. He didn't need to. When the squadron took off that day, the light caught on the silver wings like fire. The engines roared, dozens of them. And for a brief moment, the earth itself seemed to tremble. High above, over the North Sea, Anders looked out at the horizon. The formation stretched endlessly. Bombers ahead, Mustangs all around. He could almost see Marie there, just ahead of him, weaving through the clouds. He smiled. Then he tightened his grip on the stick and followed. Every pilot had his own ritual. Some carried a photograph. Some whispered a prayer. Others said nothing at all. They didn't fly for medals or headlines. They flew for the man next to them. for the crews below them, for the one who didn't come back yesterday. Because in war, loyalty is the only thing stronger than fear. Letters kept arriving at the base, from wives, mothers, sweethearts. Most were stained with hope. A few came marked, "Return to sender." One afternoon, Anders finally handed Tobin's letter to the base chaplain. It was mailed a week later. In Kansas, a woman opened it on her porch. The paper smelled faintly of engine oil and tobacco. Inside, in her brother's handwriting, were the last words he had written. "We're flying deeper every day. The boys are brave. The new plane is fast, faster than fear. Tell Dad not to worry. If I don't make it back, tell him it was worth it. For once, we can reach them before they reach us." She folded it slowly, her hands trembling, and set it beside a photograph on the mantel. The picture showed a young man in a leather jacket, standing beside a plane named Marie. Outside, the wind moved through the wheat fields, sounding faintly like the hum of an engine. By the summer of 1944, the men who survived had become veterans, though most were barely 23. They had learned to navigate not only the skies, but the thin line between survival and sacrifice. They no longer spoke of victory as a cheer, but as a whisper, a quiet acknowledgement that they had lived another day. Each return to base was a relief and a wound. Each empty bunk another reminder of what the sky demanded in exchange for domination. The war was turning. The Allies were preparing for something larger, Normandy. But for the men of the air, the sky itself had already become a front line of faith. Anders wrote in his logbook that month, "We've won the air, but I wonder if we've lost something else. Maybe the part of us that believed flying was freedom." By the summer of 1944, the sky over Europe was no longer a battlefield. It was a verdict. The Luftwaffe's Great Black Cross, once a symbol of dominance, had become a mark of doom. The Reich's last aces flew not for victory now, but for time. Each mission was a fight against inevitability, and inevitability had a silver skin and the voice of a Merlin engine. The American bombers no longer flew in fear. Their escorts had become executioners. The P-51s didn't just protect, they patrolled, they hunted, they owned the air. In England, every airfield hummed with motion. Mechanics worked through the night, hands numb from cold and oil, tightening bolts and sealing tanks. Pilots slept in their gear, flight plans scrawled on cigarette packs. The invasion of France was coming, and the sky had to be clean. Operation Point Blank had been a gamble, to destroy the Luftwaffe before D-Day. Now, after months of relentless attacks, the gamble had paid off. Fuel plants at Leuna, Pulitz, and Merseburg burned day and night. Aircraft factories in Augsburg and Regensburg lay in ruins. Every new German fighter that rolled off the line faced a gauntlet before it even reached the front. The Reich's air defense network, once the pride of Göring's empire, was collapsing from within. But the final blow came not from a bomb, nor from strategy, but from the sky itself, the cold, blue arena where the Mustang reigned supreme. On May 12, 1944, nearly 1,000 Allied bombers roared toward Germany. Their target, synthetic oil refineries, the last veins feeding the Nazi war machine. The Luftwaffe had little left to throw at them. Or Abayas. But they threw everything anyway. Every fighter that could still fly, from veteran Bf-109s to hastily armed training aircraft, took off that morning. In all, over 300 German fighters rose to meet the Americans. It would be their last great stand. Captain Mickey, Anders, of the 354th Fighter Group, led his squadron that day. His Mustang, Marie II, gleamed silver in the dawn light. He still carried Tobin's photograph folded in his flight log. As they crossed into Germany, Anders could already see them. Dark dots rising in waves from the horizon, Looks like the whole Luftwaffe is up today, someone muttered over the radio. Anders' voice came calm and flat. Then let's finish it. The sky erupted. Contrails twisted into knots as fighters collided in the thin air. Bombers flew straight and steady, massive shadows against the clouds, while the Mustangs danced around them like wasps in a storm. Anders saw a pair of Fiendwall climbing fast beneath him. He rolled inverted, dropped behind them, and squeezed the trigger. The tracers walked across the lead plane's fuselage, or it burst into flame, disintegrating before his eyes. The second broke away, hard left. Anders followed. The two planes spiraled downward, the world a blur of blue and white. At 8,000 feet, the German tried to climb, but the Mustang's engine howled, and Anders closed the gap. One burst. One flash. The Messerschmitt vanished into the haze. All around him, the radio crackled with chaos. Break left. He's on you. Bandits, 10 o'clock high. I got him. He's going down. Anders caught sight of a bomber spinning out of control, engines on fire. The crew bailed out, white parachutes blossoming against the smoke. He couldn't look long. Everywhere he turned, the sky was filled with fire. By noon, the Luftwaffe's formations had shattered. Some German pilots rammed their targets rather than retreat. Others tried to flee, but the Mustangs chased them to the ground, strafing airfields and fuel depots on the way back. It was no longer a battle. It was an extinction. One of the surviving German pilots, Oberleutnant Franz Steigler, wrote later, "The Americans owned the sky. We were like birds with our wings burned. The Mustang, it was faster, higher, crueler, and the men who flew it, they were not boys anymore. They were reapers." That day, 47 German fighters were destroyed. Many never made it back to their bases. For every Allied loss, the Luftwaffe lost 5. The oil fields burned for weeks. And without fuel, even the best pilots were grounded. By June 6th, D-Day, the Luftwaffe could barely muster 300 aircraft over all of France. The Allies had over 12,000. On the morning of the Normandy invasion, Anders flew over the French coast. Below him, the greatest armada in history crawled across the sea. Ships, landing craft, waves of men. Above them, the sky was clear. Not a single German plane in sight. For the first time in 5 years, the skies of Western Europe belonged to freedom again. Back at the base that evening, the men watched the sunset in silence. There was no cheering, no speeches, just exhaustion, and the faint, guilty relief of survival. Anders sat alone by his plane, tracing the name Marie II on its nose. The ground crew brought him a message, confirmation that the day's mission had been a success. Fuel plants destroyed. Luftwaffe crippled. Allied invasion underway. Victory was no longer a dream. It was real. He looked at the horizon and whispered, "We did it, Red. We finally did it." In Berlin, Hermann Göring watched from his office as reports poured in. His air defense command was collapsing. He turned to his aides and said with a bitter laugh that no one joined, "When I see a Mustang over Berlin, I know the war is lost." He didn't have to wait long. Within weeks, they were there. Silver phantoms gliding above the capital, unchallenged, untouchable. The Reich that once ruled the skies now cowered beneath them. The toy plane, the one they mocked, dismissed, and underestimated, had done what no army could. It broke the spine of Hitler's Air Force. Not with arrogance, not with fury, but with precision, endurance, and quiet, mechanical grace. The P-51 Mustang was not just a machine. It was a message that freedom, once armed with the right wings, could not be stopped. When the Mustangs came, one Luftwaffe survivor said later, "We stopped fighting the enemy. We started fighting the end." When the fire died out over Europe, the silence was unbearable. Cities once roaring with the pulse of war were now graves of stone and smoke. Berlin lay in ruins, its streets twisted like scorched veins. The Reich's banners, once stretched across continents, now clung in tatters to the wind. And above it all, the sky was clear again. The same sky that had once echoed with the howl of engines and the thunder of bombs. Now, only the quiet hum of distant aircraft on patrol. The war in the air was over, and the P-51 Mustang had made it so. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was no longer an air force. It was a memory. Fuel was gone. Pilots were gone. Hope was gone. The last German sorties were desperate gestures, fragments of an empire already falling apart. Young boys of 17 were sent to fly against Mustangs, their faces pale beneath oversized helmets, their eyes already hollowed by fear. Most never returned. Those who did spoke of the silver shapes in the sky. Fast, silent, merciless. The Mustang didn't need to prove anything anymore. It simply watched, like a witness to the end. At airfields across England, the tone had changed. Where once the hangars rang with the frantic rhythm of war, now there was only the slow dismantling of victory. Pilots who had lived for the mission now faced a strange kind of silence. They cleaned their gear. They wrote letters home. They stood beside the wings of their planes and tried to understand what it meant to have survived. Captain Mickey Anders returned from his final mission in March 1945. He landed at Bodney Airfield, taxied Marie II to her hard stand, and cut the engine. For a long moment he didn't move. The propeller spun to a stop, and with it, the sound that had carried him through war. He opened the canopy and the cold air hit him. Sharp, unfamiliar, alive. Someone handed him a telegram. His hands trembled as he read it. It was from the War Department. First Lieutenant James Tobin, KIA. Deepest regrets. He already knew, but seeing it in print was different. He folded the paper once, twice, then slipped it into his jacket pocket. He never spoke of it again. The Mustang's work was done. It had flown 213,000 missions, destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft, and escorted thousands of bombers home. But its true victory wasn't counted in numbers. It was in the quiet look between two returning pilots who'd both made it back. It was in the letter that reached a mother instead of the silence that didn't. It was in the way the world would never again underestimate the power of small beginnings. For the Luftwaffe, the loss went deeper than defeat. It was the death of belief that technology and willpower could bend the laws of fate. In the ruins of airfields like Rhein and Fassberg, burnt-out Mi-262 jets sat abandoned beside wrecked Messerschmitts. The jets had come too late. Brilliant, powerful, but starved of fuel and time. The men who once mocked the toy plane now stared at its shadow painted across the sky. For them, it was not just the enemy's machine. It was a mirror reflecting their own downfall. After the surrender, captured German pilots were questioned by Allied intelligence. When asked which aircraft they feared most, the answer was always the same: the Mustang. Not because it was invincible, but because it was relentless. It stayed with the bombers, it chased you home, and it never ran out of range. You could outrun a Spitfire, you could outclimb a Thunderbolt, but you could never escape a Mustang. When peace came, many Mustangs were parked in long, silent rows, their wings streaked with oil, their canopies clouded with dust. Some were sold, some scrapped, some flown by farmers in open skies. But to the men who had flown them, they were more than machines. They were companions, the thin line between life and death, between memory and oblivion. Captain Anders visited his Mustang one last time before shipping home. He placed his hand on the cool metal skin as if to thank it. Then, he walked away, leaving behind not just a war, but a part of himself. The Luftwaffe's fall was total. From the ashes of its defeat, the age of air power was reborn. Not through arrogance, but through the understanding that control of the sky could decide the fate of the earth. The P-51 Mustang had not just ended a war, It had defined the future. Its engine's echo would become the heartbeat of a new world order, one built on speed, range, and precision. And yet, for those who had lived it, there was no triumph in that sound, only the faint hum of memory, the sound of ghosts still circling somewhere high above the clouds. They laughed at it once, the narrator whispers. But in the end, it was the laughter that died first. When the war ended, the world exhaled, but it did not forget. The smoke lifted from Europe's skies, revealing the scars beneath. Cities shattered, hearts hollowed, and airfields silent except for the wind brushing across abandoned wings. Among them, in neat, endless rows, stood the P-51 Mustangs, gleaming like ghosts of a war that had devoured everything. They had done their work too well. Now, peace had no use for them. Yet the silence that followed was not an ending. It was remembrance. Because the Mustang was more than aluminum and fuel and fire. It was the voice of a generation that refused to be erased. A promise, carved into the cold sky, that tyranny would never again own the air. It carried not only bombs, but the weight of belief. Belief that ordinary men, given the right tools and faith, could challenge an empire that once seemed invincible. In the post-war years, many of those men returned home. They became teachers, engineers, mechanics, fathers. They traded flight suits for shirts and ties, but part of them always remained up there, in the thin blue silence where the Mustang once roared. Some kept their flight logs by their bedside. Some still woke at night when a plane passed overhead. And some, like Captain Mickey Anders, never spoke of the war again. Not because they forgot, but because they remembered too well. At air shows decades later, when old Mustangs were restored flown in now, why? The crowds would fall silent at the first sound of the Merlin engine. It was not nostalgia they felt, it was reverence. That high, rolling growl, a smooth, mechanical, alive, was more than a sound. It was the echo of youth, of loss, of a time when the sky itself trembled under the weight of history. People would look up, shielding their eyes, and whisper, "That's the sound of freedom." The Luftwaffe pilots who survived spoke of it differently. To them, the Mustang was not an enemy. It was the messenger of fate, a machine that reminded them, even in defeat, that courage and skill were not theirs alone. Franz Steigler, once one of Germany's top aces, met American pilots years later. When asked what he thought of the P-51, he smiled faintly. "She was honest," he said. "If she came for you, it was because she earned the right." In museums today, a few Mustangs still stand, polished, suspended mid-flight as if they might take off again at any moment. Their wings bear names, unit insignias, faint bullet scars. Children press their hands against the glass, eyes wide. They see a plane. What they don't see is what it carried. Fear, hope, exhaustion, love. The invisible cargo of war. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The soft click of a pilot's lighter, the scratch of a pen on a letter never sent, the hum of an engine waiting for orders. The Mustang's victory was not just in the destruction it brought, but in the life it preserved. It gave bombers a chance to return. It gave soldiers on the ground a chance to breathe. It gave history a chance to move forward. And in doing so, it taught the world something simple, something enduring. That greatness often begins as doubt. They laughed at it once. The toy plane. Underpowered, unimpressive, unworthy of war. But it was that laughter that fueled its rise, that disbelief that sharpened its edge. And when it took to the sky, it carried the lesson higher than anyone could imagine. That no machine, no man, no nation should ever be underestimated. The war ended. The Mustangs went silent, but their story did not. Because every time a free man looks up and sees a clear sky, somewhere, faintly, the echo of that Merlin still lingers. A whisper of power, a memory of sacrifice, a reminder that history, real history, is written not in glory, but in the sound of an engine that refused to quit. The skies over Europe are quiet now, but if you listen closely, you can still hear them.